of culture that's underneath the apparent superficial diversity, the apparent diversity that is very superficial. What is really important is the cultural deep structure, and we could go on and on about that, but that is really a key point. And it's not only true on the continent of Africa, it's true of African people wherever they are, including in the Western diaspora, including in the United States of America.
These two dances developed at two different times in two different continents.
That's why culture becomes very important. That's why people cannot tell us that culture, you know, is something that, I mean, it's important, but don't worry about it. It is important. Because if our children are to succeed, they have got to have a positive sense of who they are, who they have been, so that they will know what they can be.
People used to think of culture as, say, the spirit of a society, the basic ideas and symbols and things of that sort. Okay, that is one sort of standard intellectual view of culture. Second view of culture, especially pushed by the anthropologists, was a little bit broader and basically thinks of culture as the way of life of a people, which includes their material objects, their arts, but also their customs. So that's a very mixed bag.
After this, your first question is, what is culture, or what is a working definition of culture? For the purposes of this segment of African American Culture, a second look, let's just call culture whatever you can learn.
In this edition of our 10-part series, we're going to examine the assumptions most of us make about culture. Can a people deprived of native language and forced to shed traditional lifestyles retain any vestige of their original heritage? Traditional scientific research says no, and they point to what they see as an absolute separation between Black Americans and traditional African culture. But there's a volume of information to dispute those claims. The Black fraternity step routines you just saw clearly mimic traditional South African boot dances. While this example may seem like a coincidence to some, California psychologist Dr. Wade Noble says it's one of many instances where Blacks in America have kept or tapped into their African roots almost subconsciously.
Because culture is a mental process, and what happened in our trek to the New World is that we were prohibited from engaging in certain behavioral practices, but the psychology or the mentality of African people never was destroyed. It, in fact, part of the intellectual theoretical community tries to talk about the transmission of information, likes to talk about information be transmitted overtly and intentionally from one generation to the next, where in the African tradition, you have to evaluate people from their cultural spirit or space.
For the last 200 years, traditional historians had two premises about African American culture. First, most history and sociology books teach us slavery destroyed all cultural ties Black Americans had to Africa. Most historians would also have us believe that African culture existed in an uncivilized and undeveloped environment before the Europeans came. Both tenets of traditional wisdom are wrong. In the next half hour, we'll show you sophisticated pre-European African cultures which had wealth, respect, writing, commerce, and governments organizing the lives of millions of people. To contradict the theory Black Americans lost all African culture as slaves, we'll examine linguistic, social, and musical research from Dr. Rosalind Jeffries, Dr. Wyatt T. Walker, and Dr. Asa Hilliard. One of the most obvious areas to see Black Americans' ties to Africa comes from linguistics. If we compare Black American dialect with some dominant West African languages, we see an amazing amount of often overlooked cultural continuity.
And we know that when African people were brought to this country, we were not sat down in a classroom at Atlanta University and taught how to speak the King's English. We had to pick it up as we could pick it up. And so we have African people taking in this new language, this English language, and adapting it to the way that they spoke, their traditional ways of speaking.
FT, ST, SKLD, and the suffix ING. In the English language, these consonant clusters are distributed. In West African language, they are not. Therefore, in African American languages, words like drift, swift, and left will be drift, swift, and left.
But as more Black American scholars begin to see similarities, more of the ties to African culture start to fit. Some of them seem very obvious, as Ebonics specialist Dr. Ernie Smith explained during this 1979 PBS interview in San Diego.
Relexification is a process of acquiring or restructuring a language. In the case of the English language, we have an example here of some languages having a verb system that is aspectual and some having a tense system. In this particular case, we have the Latin ego amo tu, which the English equivalent would be I love you, but the verb order, subject, verb, object, is not Latin. So relexification has occurred for African speech in that you won't find a copula verb. She, gone. We don't have a verb to expressly predicate present tense. He, they, mine. Whose are these? They, mine. There's no verb to be.
No possessive statement.
No possessive or copula verb, as they're called in linguistics.
In 1979, when few people knew about Ebonics, the study of African American speech, in 1989, Black scholars have moved forward from the richness and wisdom of African oral traditions. Now they've started to dismiss the calculated inaccuracies spread about the intelligence of African slaves. Most of us have learned those slaves came to the New World unable to write. That's not true. They may not have known how to speak or write English, but many spoke several languages and knew how to write in their native tongues.
If you saw a people's writing, and you were told that they had no writing, you would call it decoration. If you saw Chinese being written and you did not know this was a formal language, you would indeed say, oh, they do good decoration.
What proof do we have to support these claims? Well, the writings themselves.
Well, let me just show you Nsibidi, Mende, the Moom script from the Cameroons, the Vi script from Liberia, and the Bete script from the Ivory Coast. And it's important to expose students to all these different writing systems, because that destroys the myth that African people had no systems of writing, that African people did not write. It's a myth. It's a lie.
Mrs. Harris wrote the essay on literature for Portland, Oregon's groundbreaking research on African studies. You can read part of that research in the Portland Baseline Essays. This project took almost a decade to develop and now used by Atlanta schools in their infusion program. During her research on writing, Mrs. Harris looked at Black Americans' cultural linguistic ties to West Africa. But while doing that research, she discovered possible ties the writing in West Africa may have to East Africa, specifically the land of Kemet, which most of us know by its Greek name, Egypt.
Here you have the Nsibidi script on your right, and then you have the Egyptian script on the left. Look at the similarities. Look at them. Comparison between the Egyptian script and the Tolma signs. Look at the similarities. See, when you look at stuff like this, then it becomes very hard for people to tell you that, well, Egypt was isolated. Egypt was not a part of Africa. The Mende signs. This is Vi. the moon. You know, what's so interesting, some of them are identical.
As we have explained in earlier segments of this series, the original people to live in Kemet didn't look like the residents there today. The faces of the pharaohs, their own written description of themselves as black people of the black land, and extensive research by scholars such as Dr. Asa Hilliard means the people we show you now may have had their descendants brought to the Americas as slaves. By now it's fairly obvious you can't talk about African American culture without having accurate facts about African history. But it gets hard to talk about contributions if no one knows what they are.
Have you ever studied Africa?
No.
No.
Not at all?
No.
No. But I have studied Switzerland.
Have you studied China?
No.
Have you studied Mexico?
Few Americans, black or white, realized the African continent had thriving city-states, trade routes, governments, and kingdoms before the Europeans came.
But information does exist which helps us understand African continuity with African American continuity. Books such as this by Richard Hall. In African Cities and Towns Before the European Conquest, Hall gives us pictures, documentation, and more specifically, information about African lifestyles, some of those habits and pieces of culture we see in African Americans today.
Salaga, Gayo, Segu, all large pre-European African towns. Some grew on the banks of the Niger River. Others supported populations of about 400,000, and this according to European accounts. West African market cities such as Janae and Gayo were wealthy and prosperous, with residents buying and selling gold in 1596. Two of these towns were probably founded somewhere around 822 to 921 AD. Travelers from Europe and other places described the inhabitants as exceedingly rich, and the cities stood as homes for many doctors, judges, priests, and learned men. This type of praise also denotes a high standard of learning during what we call Europeans' Dark Ages.
When Europe was having its Dark Ages, there were no Dark Ages in the rest of the world. Africans was having an age of enlightenment, the Chinese were having an age of enlightenment, and the people of India was having an age of enlightenment. We have a tendency to take European terminology and stretch it across the whole world. But there were no comparable Dark Ages in the rest of the world until the European came.
Okay.
The European came out of his Dark Age and created a Dark Age for the rest of the world by the destruction of their civilization.
Again, accurate research supports these claims. Internationally respected author and African scholar Dr. Ivan van Sertima says, for centuries, Africans surpassed Europeans in many areas. He says as late as the 1800s, Europeans came to the Africans to learn advanced techniques in science, medicine, and antibiotics.
They also observed the cleanness with which they cut the abdomen. They observed how they collapsed the abdominal wall. They observed how they stitched. They observed also that the African surgeons with consummate skill used the cautery iron in such a way that they could stop internal bleeding during the operation almost instantly with minor tissue damage using the hot irons. And all this was brought back. It was described in great detail. It was drawn and brought back into Europe.
Again, give me the year and give me the civilization that used these advanced medical techniques.
This was observed by a team that went out towards the end of the 1870s. It's somewhere around 1878 that it was published in the Edinburgh Medical Journal. It was on the team Dr. Felkin from Britain and Scotland, a joint British-Scottish team. It was observed among the Banyuro.
Now, at the beginning of this program, we define culture as whatever you can learn. Using that definition, the ancient Africans were a very cultured people before the Europeans came. Learning and libraries held a great deal of importance to these people.
There were books, formal books, parchment, papyrus books, thousands of them along the Nile and the temples At Timbuktu, you had formal books back